All right. So my name's Jada Irving. I am a student of National University, and today we're going to have a presentation on the origins of psychopathology. I presented it in a TV screen form because this is a throwback TV. It may look a bit futuristic to some, it may look weird to some, and that's the basis of today's lecture, figuring out what's abnormal and the history of how people determined abnormal behavior and mental disorders. So first we'll start off with the basics. What is psychopathology? So psychopathology is the study of mental disorders. It covers their causes, the development of what occurs for the disorder, and the treatment that's necessary. It's evolved over centuries, and in ancient times to modern approaches, our understanding completely continues to change. For instance, as we'll go over today, you'll see that we'll go over a case study. We'll hear about thinkers like Thomas Szasz and David Rosenhan and discuss where we have come today as a society, and analyze the future of the field. So we'll start off with, like I said, the case study. This is Vivian Wheeler, also known as the Bearded Lady. Can you close your eyes for a second and imagine that you have a condition that makes you an anomaly? You're different to the society, whether figure out whatever the condition is that you want to have, right? And society just makes you feel abnormal. You feel abnormal in your own home. There's nowhere that you go that you feel safe. But then you do find a safe space eventually. And what do you think you want to do? You want to hold on to this space. You want to flourish in this space because this is the one place that has made you find comfort and feel comfortable in your unique self. So this is the case of Vivian Wheeler. She was born with a condition called hypertrichosis, and it pretty much just means it causes excessive hair growth on her face. As a woman, as we know, according to society, it's not necessarily normal for women to have a beard. That's more of a man thing. So because of this, in her own home, she felt like an outcast, and her father sold her to a circus. And at the circus, she performed as what was known as the Bearded Lady. That's how she got that name. She lived her life as an attraction, of course, in the circus, and she was just a spectacle for people to see. Um, the thing that made people raise question was because she didn't want to leave the circus. Why? Going back to what I had you guys imagine before, she didn't, this was the one place that allowed her to be herself and she felt safe. Um, whether it just so happens that it was a circus that it occurred. And this was the place that normalized the fact that she had something that was different. So not only was it work for her, but it was also a community. It was where she was accepted. She was valued by adding value to a show because of the way she looked. And then when she wasn't at the circus, everybody looked at her like this weird freak and she was an outcast. So people then questioned abnormality when it came to her. And it was considered, something must be wrong with her because why would you want to stay in a circus? Why wouldn't you want to leave the circus and, you know, live a normal life? But people didn't necessarily recognize that her life wasn't normal because of the way that people treated her. So that brings me to discussing historical views of psychopathology. Abnormal behavior was often explained through supernatural or religious lenses. And this pretty much just means it was you either had a demonic possession or you caused some sort of sin that made you therefore be punished, and that's why you had a mental disorder or illness. It wasn't seen as what we see it today. Thank God that, some people are born with differences. They go through things and experiences. We know that now, but historically, it was new for them. So for them, it had to be some supernatural, you know, unrealistic hero thing that happened to where you have an illness, and this was, or it was your punishment for sinning from the gods, or you were, possessed. And that led to things like, exorcism. So how we see shows and movies about people undergoing exorcisms because they're possessed. This is honestly what people used to think historically mental illness was. You had a demonic possession and you needed to be exorcised. Um, some treatments even went as extreme to trepanation, which is drilling holes in the skull. Um, Crazy. Imagine that you have anxiety and you go to the doctor and they're like, okay, well, we'll drill some holes in your skull and try to fix you. As we know now, thankfully, it's not how medicine works, and it has evolved. Because that it sucks that this is the type of thing that people really believed back then, but it is where we come from in the progression of psychopathology. So moving on to some modern perspectives, as I spoke about with Thomas Saz. So as a lot of us know, Sigmund Freud is Simon Freud, excuse me. He is known for his theories when it comes to early childhood experiences and unresolved conflicts of the unconscious. And typically, with his theory, this occurs usually within early childhood. And his theories came about in the 19th and 20th century, which kind of sparked an interest in thinkers and theorists, opening their minds to differences that can occur and why they occur. It sort of started a revolution, for lack of better words. When we speak about Thomas Saz, he's known for a very famous essay known as The Myth of Mental Illness. In this essay, he basically argued that labeling people as mentally ill was a way to control deviant behavior or behavior that society didn't deem normal. And it might not have been medically necessary. He highlighted that many mental illnesses are explained in terms of diseases of the brain and technically not of the mind. So therefore, if it's a brain disease, is it actually a mental illness? Because nothing's wrong with their mind, something's wrong with an organ, their brain. So therefore, he believed that society often labeled individuals as mentally ill in order to exert control over them, similar to the way that religious authorities did in the Middle Ages, and they labeled nonconformists as witches because that would make society be against them, and therefore they have to be punished or controlled because they're not conforming to society's norms. Saz maintained that what we call mental illness is often a reflection of societal discomfort with behaviors that are known as non-normative. So depression and anxiety, according to Saz, they weren't illnesses the same way that cancer or diabetes is. They actually are personal struggles or they're personal struggles of moral and existential crisis. So he pretty much highlighted that, the pharmaceutical things of behavior and medicalization of behavior, he raised question of, is it a scientific purpose or a social purpose? Are we just trying to control people and have them conform to one idea of what society should look like? Or do we need to question and dig a little deeper if these people actually have these illnesses that you say they have? Of course, at this time, it was very controversial, but it definitely raised question in the field, and it had a lasting impact within the field. He encouraged professionals with this essay to actually critically start evaluating the labeling of mental illness and diagnosing. It also made professionals in the field really start to think about social and cultural biases. I just want to highlight how important that is in America, because as we know, we live in a country that's a melting pot. Majority of our states right now have a bunch of immigrants coming in. So that's just an example of completely different cultures in one place, and what may be normal in, let's say, Colombia or Venezuela, Trinidad, where I'm from, may not be the norm here for most Americans. However, that's something to put into perspective before we immediately label someone with, as a patient with a mental disorder, versus they just may have a different culture. So he really raised question in the field to really focus on evaluation and have different observations. A quote from him that I found was, "If you talk to God, you're praying. But if you hear God talk to you, you have schizophrenia." Great point. When people, a lot of religious individuals say that, God spoke to me and he told me I should do this, or I'm in this field because God told me to. So if you just walk in somewhere and say, I heard God, in previous years, historically, you may be considered schizophrenic and labeled as you have a mental illness or a mental disorder, which actually brings me to my next point with the Rosenhan experiment. David Rosenhan, he has a project on being sane in insane places, and it's basically a experiment that he did to highlight in the field how people are diagnosed, mislabeled, and then this label sticks with them. The experiment, he placed 8 pseudo patients. Pseudo patients are healthy individuals who fake illnesses. So basically, these individuals fake the fact that they can hear people in psychiatric hospitals. So they basically went into a hospital and they told the workers there that they can hear multiple voices in their head. They were obviously admitted, and it turns out that they were kept in the hospital for 19 days. Even after being admitted, they obviously started to behave their normal selves, being healthy, and they were still treated as though they had schizophrenia without any significant evaluation to truly diagnose them. It was pretty much, I said I can hear voices, so I'm diagnosed as schizophrenic and I have to be treated as such in this hospital. The point of the experiment was to test, is there an accurate evaluation that's done in order to distinguish mentally ill from individuals that are perfectly healthy? What is the evaluation process? Similar to how we spoke about previously with SAS, this experiment also raised a lot of question within the industry, and it highlighted the power of these labels. Once you're labeled as something, this is how people will treat you. In the hospital, even though these patients, because they were healthy, started acting very healthy, because their initial entrance into the hospital was the fact that they hear multiple voices, they were labeled as schizophrenic, and the rest is history. The medical professionals didn't exactly do further observation and evaluation to confirm this diagnosis. They just continued treating them as if they were schizophrenic and therefore keeping them institutionalized. So this called into question, like I said, the objectivity of diagnosis. It's typically reliant on being subjective, one fits all when it comes to whatever your diagnosis is. But that's a flaw because it should be objective as far as what is the background of this. Similarly, of course, everything has critiques. So there was critique on Rosenhan's experiment from a psychiatrist known as Robert Spitzer. And he was known as like one of the most vocal critics when it came to pseudoscience or fake science, like people posing with certain illnesses or whatever it may be for the experiment. He argued that this was an unfair critique of psychiatry because it failed to recognize the complexity of the diagnosis process. He highlighted that the psychiatric professionals were misled because the patients were stating that they had fake systems. And he argued that real world value of diagnosis should not be dismissed because of this particular experiment that included manipulation. he also highlighted that most conditions require more than just this one observation. So more than just you walking into the hospital and telling people that you hear things. Typically, conditions for diagnosis include more observations from different patterns of life, whether it be your background, your medical history, physically observing you, you know. So this was his critique. And he rejected what Rosenhan's experiment was saying, was that psychiatry and the diagnosis of conditions are flawed. This goes on to our current perspectives. We have what many of us know as the DSM-5 and the biopsychosocial model. And this pretty much just integrates biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors. There are clinicians such as Denton who emphasize that mental health should be understood in the context of an individual's environment. So that means, what is their family like? What are the pressures that society has put on them? What are their relationships like? As we see in this diagram, age, gender, genetics, mental health, emotional health, their beliefs, interpersonal relationships, social support. All of this plays a role when you're diagnosing someone, because this alters essentially how they experience the world, because these factors play such a large role in creating one human being. So this holistic understanding is the fact that there's so much to integrate when it comes into diagnosing, that it's important that we pay attention to all of this, because mental illness is very complex and it's not as singular as historically they may have viewed it. Mental health is a multi-dimensional concept, and one factor before, where it was like, oh, you sinned, so this is a punishment from God. That's not exactly how that works. Again, thankfully, we have evolved to understand this. So with the DSM-5, this is actually one of our major contributions, in the field, because for those of you who do not know, the DSM-5 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We're currently at the 5th edition. This is a book that professionals in the field swear by, because it highlights all of the different mental disorders that we have discovered that individuals can have. The book is constantly updated with new symptoms as case studies and everything continue to be researched within the field. This is such an important contribution because not only is it consistently updated with the times, but it also is a basic blueprint, I would say, for mental disorders and the large array of disorders that exist. Another contribution is trauma-informed care. And going back to how we spoke about mental illness is not singular, how experiences that individuals go through can cause mental illnesses, disorders, or distortions in their cognition, such as PTSD. As we have heard, I'm sure when that comes to mind, you can envision for yourself what comes to mind when you hear PTSD. But I know for myself, war comes to mind, and veterans, people who have gone through such traumatic experiences where they're seeing lives lost. They may be the hands of some lives lost. And these experiences are not everyday experiences. So therefore, they do have a distortion in their minds as far as society, perspective on the world, what it means to live in this world, what humans are like. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to just be thrown in a hospital. It's important that we have specific types of care to understand these people's experiences and understand how it can change their psychological. So trauma-informed care is one of those examples. Another example that incorporates this holistic approach is how a lot of professionals will combine cognitive behavioral therapy that addresses maladaptive thoughts and behaviors, but they'll combine that with trauma informed care, so trauma focused therapy or family systems therapy. And this addresses the broader aspect of the patient's life. And this pretty much just shows that we're making a shift towards flexible approaches and personalized approaches. I personally, when I think about this field, I think about how unique humans are. And it's very important that we continue to develop these models and theories and ways of care with our clients, because life is so different for people that there's so many aspects that can go in to said mental disorder or mental illness. It's not just one thing equals the other. If we look forward to the future, we have what's the best way to put it? We pretty much have an explosion right now of what is known as epigenetics. And it's the study of how gene expression is influenced by environmental factors, It increasingly demonstrated that life experiences such as stress or trauma can leave biological marks on our genes, and that in turn influences our mental health. Research like this could lead to more targeted treatments. And again, going back to that flexible, personalized approach, when we understand how these sorts of things are manipulated through our genes and then therefore a reflection on our mental health, it goes even deeper to how unique approaches have to be, because as many of us may or may not know, there's no double DNA. Everyone has their own DNA. So if mental health has a connection so deep as it goes into genes, then it's like, no, we definitely have to even make our approaches even more personalized. Um, it's always important, though, while these advancements are exciting and it leads us to think about the future, we do have to consider challenges that still, unfortunately exist, as with everything. Mental illness continues to be a barrier for treatment because public awareness, how we spoke about Vivian Wheeler, there's still a stigma when it comes to mental health and taking care of your mental health and figuring out about your mental health. So there's so many undiagnosed people that still exist within the world because of this stigma, and you don't want people to label you. There's a scare to be labeled, honestly, culturally and societal attitudes towards mental health. A lot of cultures, mine, for example, I went into this field because I want to expose the fact that it's okay to take care of your mental health to personally Caribbean and African American communities. It's still very much taboo. I still find myself explaining to some uncles and aunts like what I do, and it's not, I don't only deal with, the crazy people that you see on the street. Those might be my clients, but the same way we're talking here is my everyday client. Like, it doesn't mean that you're absolute, losing it because you're seeking therapy or going to get a psychological evaluation. You're just finding out more about yourself. It's self-discovery. But stuff like this really is a barrier to people seeking help. It's also, unfortunately, still very inaccessible. Recently, I had an insurance issue because an insurance pretty much a lot of, stopped covering, I should say, a lot of couples diagnosis because, you know, it's not that important, whatever their reasoning is. But because of this, it's expensive to not have coverage for dealing with your mental health and having to come out of pocket. As we know, hospital bills are outrageous. So taking care of your health is very expensive, especially if you don't have insurance that is covering it. So these disparities are important if we want this mental health field to continue to progress. To conclude, psychopathology has evolved from these supernatural and religious explanations to more complex models such as the biopsychosocial. And people like Thomas Szasz and David Rosenhan have challenged the status quo and listed questions. And thankfully, have contributed to the progression of the field and making professionals, cross their T's and dot their I's and really make sure that there's a lot going into these labels that are placed onto individuals. And it really has made professionals critically examine their methods and go back. And that's why we have things like the DSM-5 on the 5th edition. There's continuing to be updates. And as we continue to move forward, it's clear that psychopathology is as much as it is about society and environment as it is about science and brain chemistry. I just want to thank you all for joining me for today's lecture. And next time you hear someone talk about mental illness, remember the different levels of complexity that go into it and what really defines normal versus abnormal. Thank you all for joining me. Again, I'm Jada Irving.